Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight for another guided meditation and Dhamma talk from Bhante Suddhaso here at MT Cloud Monastery in New Jersey. So, welcome so far to Elaine, Kauser Friend, Adine, Denise, Robin, Mark, Melinda, Kumu, and Mary. So, good to see everyone. If you have questions at any time, both after the meditation and during the talk, feel free to type them in, and then we'll address them at the end. But for now, I'll pass things over to Bhante Suddhaso, who will guide us in some meditation.
Good evening. So, as usual, please get in a upright sitting position, taking a few seconds to rock from side to side, making sure that your body is properly balanced on your sitting bones. You can lean forward and then slowly straighten up to make sure your spine is balanced on your hips. Roll your shoulders up and back. Let them just melt down your back. And bring your hands together to rest gently in your lap. Push up a bit with the crown of your head. This helps to straighten the spine. Tilting the chin very slightly forward so that the spine is completely straight all the way from your hips to the top of your head. You can either close your eyes or let them rest unfocused, pointed at the ground about 1 meter in front of you. Take a few long, slow, deep breaths. With each breath, letting the body and mind relax. So for the next few minutes, there's nothing you need to plan, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to worry about. So you can let go of all the thinking you've been doing throughout the day. You can put down all the activities, all the plans. You can put all of that aside. And just take a moment to appreciate how peaceful the mind is when we set aside its activities. How pleasant the mind is when we're not caught up in thinking and planning and worrying. How serene the mind is when we're not digging up the past or imagining the future. So bringing full attention to the ever changing present moment. You might start by bringing awareness to hearing. There's always some amount of sound present, even in the quietest room. So, whether you're in a very quiet room, in a quiet area, or in the middle of a busy city, just bring attention to the experience of hearing. So, listening very intently to each moment. Listening as though it was your favorite music. Listening as though it was the most interesting speech. Listening as though each moment was whispering an important secret. Listening with that intensity of focus and interest, with that delighted enthusiasm, wanting to catch every single sound, not wanting to miss even a moment. So listen with that intensity, that joyful intensity. And listening without judgment, not judging it as pleasant or unpleasant, just being fully aware of each moment of sound, bringing full attention to each moment of sound, and then immediately letting go of it, letting it fade, disappear, as we open up to the next moment of sound. So, moment after moment, knowing, letting go, knowing, releasing, knowing, releasing, moment after moment. Bring attention to the awareness of sound. So there is the sound, which is what we've been paying attention to so far. And there is awareness of sound. So bring attention to that awareness of hearing, awareness of an auditory world. Knowing the knower. And bringing attention to your body. So feeling the touch sensation all through the body. And paying attention to the feeling of the body with the same enthusiastic, joyful attentiveness that we brought to hearing. Bring that same enthusiastic attentiveness to feeling the body. And again, directing the mind to awareness of the awareness of the body. Direct the mind to knowing that which is aware of body sensation. There is sensation and there is awareness of sensation. Pay attention to that awareness. Now, if your eyes are closed, let them drift slightly open. And pay attention to seeing with the same joyful attentiveness that we've been bringing to hearing and feeling. Pay attention to the process of seeing, the flow of visual sensations. And again, bring attention to the awareness of seeing. There is seeing and there is awareness of seeing. Bring attention to that awareness. Paying attention to visual consciousness, visual awareness. And bring attention to the mind. So, noticing the mental objects coming and going, just as sounds flow through auditory awareness, body sensations flow through body awareness, sights flow through visual awareness. Notice the mental objects floating through mental awareness, thoughts, emotions, impulses, the mental phenomena moving through the mind moment after moment. Bring that same joyful, intense awareness to observing the flow of mental phenomena. Even when the mind is fairly quiet, there are ripples in the field of the mind. Be aware of those ripples. Pay close attention. And just as there are mental phenomena, there is the awareness of mental phenomena, awareness of a mental world. Pay attention to that awareness, awareness of the mind itself, awareness of mental objects and activities. What is the nature of this awareness? Is it permanent or is it impermanent? Is it stable or is it changing? And if we are watching this awareness, can it possibly be who we are? You can adjust your posture.
Thank you, Bhante, for that meditation. And welcome to some others joining in, William, Yudi, as well as Columbia University Buddhist Association.
Oh, wonderful. Good to see you. Great.
AP, as well as Kevin, the Kevin we know, Kevin Martino, Gita, and others who have joined in as well, behind the scenes, if you will. And welcome to our friends joining us on Instagram. So
Yes, we have quite a few friends joining tonight on Instagram. I know Miguel. I love how Miguel has tried each platform. Miguel is very updated, knows what platforms we use.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good evening, friends. So the topic for this evening is consciousness. And this is a topic which generates a fair amount of confusion, particularly when people are new to Buddhism. And one reason for this is because the word consciousness is used in quite a number of ways in non-Buddhist contexts, ways which don't necessarily relate particularly well to how the word consciousness is used in Buddhism. So it's good to have some understanding of what we mean when we say consciousness. First off, I should point out that the word consciousness is the most common English translation of the Pali word vijnana, Sanskrit vijnana, same meaning. So vijnana is composed of two parts. So the prefix vi, which can mean separate or distinct, and jnana, which means knowing. So one literal way of rendering the word vijnana would be knowing separations, knowing distinctions. That'd be one literal way of talking about it. And I'll explain later on why that might be a useful way of relating to this word. So vijnana is normally translated as consciousness. It would not be far out to translate it as awareness. Awareness would also be a good translation. And in fact, during the meditation we did just now, I was using the word awareness, but actually I was talking about vijnana. And I was intentionally not using the word consciousness to avoid the constellation of meanings that we tend to bring along with such words. So in the Pali texts, there's two main ways that the word vijnana is used. In the Mahayana text, there's a third way, which if I have time, I might talk about that third way. But to start with the two main ways it's spoken about in the Pali texts. The first most common way is referring to sensory awareness. So awareness of a sensory world, sensory domain. So one common thing that we find in the suttas is a statement like, when there is an eye and a visual object, then the meeting of the two is contact, and that's what we call consciousness. So consciousness arises from the sense organ encountering a sense object. So the ear encounters a sound, then there is auditory consciousness, ear consciousness. The tongue encounters a flavor, and there is tongue consciousness, and so on. So this is a very useful way of relating to our experience. So I was trying during the meditation instructions to communicate one way of starting to get a sense as to what sensory consciousness feels like, what it actually is. That said, it's relatively subtle, and it's not particularly easy to access with an ordinary, scattered, worldly mind. It's not particularly easy to access when one's samadhi is not strong. This is a meditation technique which I don't normally do outside of retreat. Because outside of retreat, it's hard to get good results with it. But during retreat, when the mind is extremely stable, still, focused, and alert, then meditation on sensory consciousness can be quite powerful. And so it's not an everyday meditation for me. It's something that I only use normally I only use during retreat, when the mind is at a certain level of concentration and awareness. But it's a way of starting to get beyond the superficial way of relating to sensation, which is how we normally live our lives. We normally live our lives going around fixating on, oh, there's that sound, and I hate that sound, and oh, I like that smell, and there's too much in my visual field, so I'm going to close my eyes. We tend to relate to this world and the world in this relatively simplistic way, in terms of me and the objects that I'm sensing, the objects that I'm perceiving. And if we pay a little more attention, then we can start to recognize that there is a process happening. It isn't I am seeing an object, but rather you can say there's just seeing. So relating to it as a process rather than as two solid, stable objects interacting with each other. Instead, you can observe that there is a process happening. So that's a bit more refined. Bringing attention to the awareness of sensory experience is another level of refinement. Again, this is not particularly easy if your mind is not already well concentrated and well stabilized, if it's not already very finely tuned and alert. So this is interesting because, well, it's interesting for a number of reasons, but one of its particular relevances to Buddhist practice is that we normally think of ourselves as being that which is aware of sensory experiences. We think, I am that which knows seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. But it's possible to observe sensory consciousness in operation, which means it can't possibly be who we are. So this then is a form of insight practice. It's this process of observing sensory consciousness naturally lends itself to developing the perception of not self, anatta sanya, the recognition that even sensory consciousness, which is often who we think we are, what we think we are, even sensory consciousness is not who we are. It's just a natural function, a function of the natural world. It's just what happens when an eye comes in contact with a sight. Then there's eye consciousness. That's just what happens. When an ear comes in contact with a sound, then there's ear consciousness. That's just what happens. But that's not who we are. That's not our true nature. That's not our true self. I am not that which knows sound and smell and taste and so on. So this is one of the most direct applications of sensory consciousness, is using it as a way of cultivating the perception of not-self, the perception that all phenomena are impersonal, that what we normally think of as me is in fact not me. And normally when we talk about sensory consciousness, we talk about the six senses. So eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. That's how we normally talk about it. There's a handful of suttas where the Buddha gives a slightly simpler form. So 4 domains of sensory consciousness. And this is particularly useful during meditation practice. So the 4 sense domains are sight, sound, body sensation, which includes both the touch sensation as well as smelling and tasting. So those 3 are all lumped together into body sensation. And then mind. So this is the simpler 4 sensory consciousnesses. And that's useful because during meditation, there's often not really much to smell or to taste. So you can still investigate olfactory consciousness, so nose consciousness, and tongue consciousness. You can still investigate that during meditation. There's just often not a whole lot to investigate there. There's often not a whole lot of sensory impingement on those fields. So this simplified 4-field sensory consciousness can be a useful way of making it a bit more accessible in meditation practice, which is why that was what we did during the guided meditation. We used the 4-field sensory consciousness instead of the more common 6-field sensory consciousness. So again, this is the main way that consciousness is spoken about in the Pali Suttas, is in terms of sensory consciousness, usually 6 and occasionally 4. The other way that the word consciousness is used, and this is much less common in the suttas, and there's some debate among scholars about why this usage appears. And for some reason, there's a number of scholars who really hate the idea that the Buddha spoke about consciousness in this way. I don't know why. I find it wonderful. But there's some scholars who really, really don't like this. Which is referring to consciousness as a primordial awareness which is not connected to any of the 6 senses. So we see this usage most commonly in dependent origination, Paticca Samuppada, and also in a handful of other suttas. A handful of other suttas where the Buddha speaks about a consciousness which is not connected to any particular sensory domain. In terms of Paticca Samuppada, it arises Avijja Paccaya Sankhara, Sankhara Paccaya Vijnana, Vijnana Paccaya Namarupa. So consciousness is seen as the precondition for mind and body. And then mind and body are the precondition for the arising of the 6 sense consciousnesses. So there we see consciousness being used as referring to something which is present even when the 6 sensory consciousnesses are not present. Even when there's no body and mind to be found, there can be consciousness, there can be awareness. And in dependent origination, this is particularly referring to the awareness that arises shortly after the fundamental precondition of ignorance, the fundamental precondition of delusion. So from the fundamental precondition of ignorance and delusion, then there arises the appearance of separate, distinct phenomena. So then there is consciousness, which, as I mentioned earlier, means knowing separations, knowing distinctions. there is consciousness of those separate, distinct phenomena. And then there is, well, then what am I? Oh, I am this mind and body that is aware of those other things. How is that happening? Oh, it's happening through the 6 sensory consciousnesses. It's happening through sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. So I am this body and mind with eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, which is observing those other things, those other separate, distinct phenomena, which are separate from this distinct phenomena, which I think is me. So there we can see how from that fundamental primordial awareness, that undivided consciousness, then there emerges 6 distinct forms of sensory consciousness. So this is, again, one way that consciousness is used. And there's a few other places it's used in the suttas besides dependent origination. But I'm not going to go into that at this time. One thing, I wouldn't have enough time. And for another, it doesn't really add a whole lot to the immediate discussion that we're having. But that more primordial awareness, that awareness which is not tied to any sensory consciousness, is difficult to get in direct touch with. So usually we start by backpedaling. So first we're having our ordinary spacey, hazy, delusional experience. Then we start to bring active, focused awareness to sensory experience, to sensation. Then once we have some intense awareness of sensation, then we can bring the mind back a step to awareness of sensory consciousness, which is the meditation practice that we were doing. Then from that step, you can step back to consciousness not connected to specific sensory domains. Again, this is quite subtle. It's not easy. And it's not something which is readily accessible to a mind which is wrapped up in a lot of activities and worldly concerns. And again, you can try this kind of practice whenever you like. Just be aware that it's not particularly potent outside of a retreat context, outside of a retreat setting. Still worth doing, still worth playing with. Well, one, because it's fun, it's trippy, it's interesting. And also getting some familiarity with this method then means that you can apply it more easily when the mind is well concentrated, when the mind is focused and alert. So once again, these are the 2 main ways that consciousness is used in the Pali Suttas. In the Mahayana Sutras, there's another way that it's used, which is, it's worth being aware of because it's a somewhat different way of relating to the word consciousness, but it's also quite relevant and helpful. And this is the concept of the storehouse consciousness. So Alaya Vijnana, which is, it's sometimes described as being like the seed bank in the ground. So if you dig down a little bit into the soil and closely examine the soil, then you'll find that just a few inches beneath the surface of the soil, there's a huge number of seeds. And seeds of all kinds of different plants. And when the conditions are right, then those seeds will sprout and start growing, and they'll emerge from the surface of the ground. Most of them are what people call weeds. I prefer to call them natural native grasses, but other people just call them weeds. Also lots of beautiful flowers. These people actually they call them wildflowers, but they don't understand that they're actually in exactly the same category as weeds. So whatever you call them, the point is that these seeds have been lying dormant in the ground for years, sometimes decades. And when the conditions are right, then they sprout and they emerge and they become visible. So in the same way, the concept of the Alaya Vijnana is that buried deep in our subconscious, we have seeds. Seeds of an incredible variety of different mind states, different experiences, different mental objects. And none of that is currently present in the mind. None of it is currently visible. There's just these seeds that are buried very deep in the subconscious mind, where we can't see them with our ordinary, unfocused, delusional mind. And when the conditions are right, then those seeds will manifest. So an emotion will appear in the mind, or a thought will appear in the mind, or a memory will appear in the mind. Sometimes things which don't seem to have any relation to our current experience, or even to our current life. So that's arising from this seed bank, this storehouse consciousness, this vast field of accumulated experience which lies buried deep, deep in the subconscious. And this includes a vast quantity of information and tendencies and impulses from past lives, as well as from this life. So often when we start to manifest something unexpected within our mind, it's because something has woken up a seed from the storehouse consciousness. Something has triggered the arising of a seed from the storehouse consciousness. And of course, it's mostly bad. Again, it's mostly weeds. But also in the storehouse consciousness, there's all the good things that we've done, all the good seeds that we've planted, all the seeds of wholesomeness, all the seeds of wisdom, all the seeds of compassion. That's all there as well. Again, both from this life and also previous lives. It's all there. And as we start to become more aware of how the mind works, then we can learn how to create the conditions that cause the wholesome seeds to sprout rather than the unwholesome seeds. We can learn how to nurture and cultivate the wholesome parts of the storehouse consciousness. And this is actually really good news. So sometimes when people come across Buddhist practice and they start to realize just what an incredibly gigantic job we have in front of us, ridiculously enormous task, this whole enlightenment business. And we look at what a mess we are and we're like, wow, I can't possibly do all of this in one lifetime. Good news, this isn't your first lifetime. Not the first time you've been Buddhist. Not the first time you've been training your mind. You've got countless seeds of Buddhist practice buried down in that storehouse consciousness, along with countless lifetimes of horrendous garbage. So we need to learn how to dig through that and sort out the good stuff from the trash. But good news is that, yeah, you've been a Buddhist countless times. You've been a Bodhisattva countless times. You've been practicing the Eightfold Path for many, many, many lifetimes. It's all there. You just need to learn how to create the conscious conditions that coax those wholesome seeds to come up above the surface. So this is another way of relating to consciousness, which is, again, quite different from the way of relating to it that we see in the Pali Suttas, but also a very useful way of relating to Buddhist practice, a very useful way of understanding what we're doing. And that also goes in the other direction, by the way. So as well as coaxing up the seeds from past lives, we can also think, well, I might not get enlightened in this life. That's true. But what I can do is I can pack my storehouse consciousness with as many good seeds as I can. Maybe I'm not going to see much result in this life, maybe. But I can put so many good seeds in that soil that something's going to come to fruit in future lives. That's another wholesome way of relating to the storehouse consciousness. It also helps take the sting out of it when we see lots of garbage and weeds and ugly things floating in the mind. We can just be like, well, I didn't put that there, at least not this life around. That's just some crap from my storehouse consciousness that could have been there for thousands of lifetimes. It's just coming up now when the conditions were right for it to come up. It's not me. It doesn't define me. It doesn't control me. It's just some weed sprouting in the mind. I should still make an effort to uproot it and throw it away because weeds are bad, okay? So we want to make an effort to get rid of that. But we don't need to identify as it. And we certainly don't need to play along with it. You don't need to cultivate the weeds just because that's what's growing. Unless you like the weeds, I suppose. But that's overextending the metaphor. But instead, you can recognize, oh, this mind state that's currently arising, it's a weed. It's an unwholesome phenomenon arising from a bad seed, which might have been planted hundreds of lifetimes ago. And now I have an opportunity to uproot it and discard it. So let's make the effort. Let's see what we can do to get rid of this particular weed in the heart seed roof. So I think that's enough for now. I've spoken about 3 kinds of consciousness and a little bit about how to apply them in our Buddhist practice. So maybe at this time, if there's any questions or comments, we can go ahead and have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante, for this beautiful talk. Very interesting. And Panteli Vasili has a question. How does the Buddhist understanding of consciousness relate to the physiological nature of the human brain?
Absolutely no relation whatsoever. So Buddhism is not the least bit interested in your brain. So this is one of the things that I actually find quite puzzling, is that people just assume that their brain is their mind. I don't know where they get this from. Your mind is your mind. Don't worry about your brain. The brain is just, actually, it's just a mental object, to be perfectly honest. From a Buddhist standpoint, everything is mind. Everything occurs within the mind. So your body is just a mental object. Your brain, which you've probably never seen, by the way, you just assume it's there. Your brain is also just a mental object. So people who come from scientific materialist conditioning tend to assume that the mind arises from the brain. The Buddhist standpoint is exactly the opposite. The brain arises from the mind. Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you, Bhante.
Mm-hmm. So on YouTube, we have a couple comments and questions. So Gita says, Bhante Ajahn Sumedho also speaks of this type of consciousness, I think when you were talking about the second type, where he mentioned that one's body is in the vast consciousness, not the other way around. What do you think? He further explained that consciousness is infinite.
Yeah, so there's actually a 4th way that consciousness is spoken about, which I should have mentioned in retrospect, which is the vijnana dhatu, the consciousness element, which is spoken about as being one of the basic building blocks of the universe. So one of the fundamental aspects of reality, which permeates everything, and is just as much a part of nature as water and air. And just as our bodies are all made up of water and air, which is impersonal and not ours, and in fact shared by everyone. Everybody in this room is sharing the same air. In the same way, there is the consciousness element. So there is consciousness as a fundamental building block of reality, and we're all partaking of it. We're all sharing it. So that's another way of relating to consciousness, which that may be, based on what you're saying, that may be what Ajahn Sumedho was pointing at, is the consciousness element, the vijnana dhatu, which is in fact a basic, unlimited building block of reality. Okay?
And Gita also says, I've heard in the Mahayana teaching about this eighth kind of consciousness, like a computer CPU storing our memories. How can we access this? Only via meditation?
Well, it depends what you mean by meditation. If by meditation you mean the cultivation of intense, sharp, precise self-awareness, then yeah, that's the only way. How else would you do it?
And Kevin says, Hi Bhante, aren't these seeds just a metaphor for karma? And could the same be said about the primordial consciousness from the Pali texts?
Yeah, I mean, you can relate to the Alaya Vijnana as being a function of karma, because that's actually exactly what it is. Yeah. What was the other part of the question?
Can the same be said about the primordial consciousness?
As in, is it just a metaphor for karma?
Mm-hmm.
Well, everything is karma. So if you want to just say that everything is karma, you can do that. But it's often helpful to divide things up and talk about things in different angles and different ways, as it helps to further illuminate and clarify our wisdom, help to illuminate and clarify our experience of reality.
And UD says, would the reason as to why the Buddha refers to mind-made states, or would that be the reason as to why the Buddha refers to mind-made states? I think it was probably in reference to a comment you had made.
Yeah, the Buddha is quite clear that everything is made by the mind. That's how the Dhammapada starts out. So it's a very well-known verse, but it's actually surprising. It's first verse of the Dhammapada, very well-known, heavily quoted, and yet people just don't get it. The Buddha says, mind is the maker of all things, and people are like, no, it's not. And I'm like, it's right there. How can you deny this? It's right there in the Pali texts. Mind is the maker of all things. You just can't escape this.
Yudi also says, wouldn't this indicate that there's no sensory consciousness then?
Well, technically speaking, there's only mind consciousness. That's technically true. But we subdivide it into 4 or 6 because it's useful to analyze things bit by bit. Otherwise, you just wind up practicing Soto Zen, and that works for a very tiny percentage of people. I mean, I'm all for Zen practice. I actually really like it. Silent illumination, Shikantaza, I really like it. But it's really difficult. So starting by practicing subdivision forms of meditation, so dividing reality up into discrete sections and analyzing those discrete sections in terms of the perceptions of insight, forms the necessary development of mind, which makes it possible to use a undivided style of meditation. So yeah, technically there is only mind consciousness, but that mind consciousness can be seen as having 6 seemingly distinct functions. And analyzing those 6 seemingly distinct functions separately is a good way of honing and sharpening our wisdom. Okay. Anything else?
Yes, actually. So both IO Access and Pantili Bassini are asking, ask for some literature recommendations on the Buddhist view of consciousness.
Yeah, the Pali Suttas. I recommend reading the Pali Suttas, all of them, cover to cover. That's a great place to start. As far as consciousness, I think Bhante Analayo wrote something on it a while back. Do you remember the name of it?
Not
Not Bhante and Alio. I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not really a gigantic fan of a lot of secondary literature. Actually, much can be illuminated just by reading the suttas. And actually, with all the time people spend reading secondary literature, they could have just read through all the suttas. Like, I know people who they've read stacks and stacks of books by every contemporary Buddhist teacher. And I'm like, that stack of books is 10 times the size of the Pali Suttas. You could have read only 90% of those books and the Pali Suttas, and you would understand Buddhism 100 times better. So really, read the suttas. If you really want to understand what the Buddha was teaching, read the suttas. Okay?
And Adine says, when fixing intensely on visual awareness, what I see seems to pixelate into meaningless colors. It's uncanny and disorienting. However, there still seems to be an I who's doing the seeing.
Oh yeah, I mean, all kinds of wacky things can happen when you're meditating on visual consciousness. You can have times where your entire vision is replaced with like little glowing sparks. That's fun. You can have times when the whole visual field seems to vanish. It doesn't seem to be anything there at all. Or it's all replaced with golden light, or it's all replaced with, like all kinds of things can happen. Or what's present starts distorting and shifting in strange ways. These are all things that can occur. Doesn't matter. It's really beside the point. Don't get distracted by it, but also don't be disturbed by it. Just let it come and go, like anything else. Neither accepting nor rejecting, neither approving nor disapproving. Just let it come and go. Recognize it as impermanent, but don't get wrapped up in it. Don't get wrapped up in liking and disliking. Yeah, and if you find that you're strongly resistant to some visual experience that's happening, well, then look at that. What's going on there? Why are you throwing away your equanimity? And then get your equanimity back. What was the rest of the question?
There still seems to be an I who's doing the seeing. An I as in me.
Yeah. Yeah, so try to see if you can observe the seeing as a process which is happening regardless of your volition. Can you actually say, now I'm going to stop seeing things, and the seeing stops? Can you actually do that? Now I'm going to start seeing again, and the seeing starts up again. Can you actually do that? Or does the seeing seem to have a life of its own? Have a closer look. What is this seeing that's happening? And once again, if you are observing the seeing, how could the seeing possibly be you? So have a closer look. Have a closer look at what's going on here with visual consciousness. I should say, by the way, that of the 6 consciousnesses, seeing and mind, so eye consciousness and mind consciousness, tend to be by far the most difficult. Body consciousness and hearing consciousness tend to be the easiest, which is one reason why in Buddhist meditation there's usually so much emphasis placed on body mindfulness practices. So practices focused on mindfulness of body sensation, the touch sensation. It's by far the easiest for most people. Hearing is also relatively easy. Eye consciousness is actually quite challenging. And mind consciousness is very challenging for most people, not for everyone. For some people, it's otherwise, but this is how it is for most people. So if eye consciousness is really difficult for you, you're not alone. Sometimes it's fine to do ones that are easier for a while until as you start to develop the skill, and then try the ones that are more difficult and see if maybe it's gotten a bit easier. And also, as I said several times, this is very much dependent upon how well developed your mind is at that time. Uh, these are, as I said previously, these are practices that I normally do during retreats, preferably long retreats. They're not practices that I normally do on a day-to-day basis, because the mind has to be already quite subtle in order to really understand the functioning of consciousness. Anything else?
Kevin says, the meditation technique you used tonight, is it similar to the sixth element meditation?
There's some overlap. So as I mentioned earlier, the Vijnana Dhatu, the consciousness element, there's some overlap, but I wouldn't equate them. In my mind, these are distinctly different techniques.
And Yudi said, it's because science tends to think that consciousness sits somewhere in the brain. Science sees everything as physical matter. They'll never find it in the brain, though. That's my opinion.
Yeah, this is actually the tremendous blind spot of modern science, which I keep hoping they'll get past one of these days. The unrecognized assumption that everything is physical. It's the deeply held faith, the deeply held unexamined belief at the heart of scientific materialism.
And Reynaldo asks, what's the original mind? How is it related to consciousness?
So, original mind is a term that's commonly used in Zen. And what is the original mind? One, that's a meditation technique. Ask yourself, what is the original mind? Two, if you want me to give a Dhamma talk, well, there's not enough time for that this evening, but we could do it another time.
And Clarkish says, I noticed that the unwholesome, maybe, inside me can be, so the unwholesomeness inside me can be aroused by the unwholesomeness of others I surround myself with. How can I address this?
Surround yourself with good people. And when circumstances push you into the presence of not so good people, be extremely careful. Watch your mind very closely. Practice self-restraint as much as you can. Constantly remind yourself of the teachings of the Buddha. But yeah, the Buddha placed huge importance on having wholesome spiritual friends. Not to waste your time associating with unwholesome people. Doesn't do you any good. It only drags you down, and it doesn't help them either. Don't waste your time. Okay, anything else?
Bhante Lee Vasily has another question. What is the most accessible translation of the sutras?
Well, it depends on what you like. One which I recommend is Bhante Suddhaso's translations, which are all for free on Sutta Central. So you can just go to the website Sutta Central and you can find all his translations. He's done the whole Pali Suttas, all of them. And he wrote them intentionally to be very simple and easy to read. That was his intention in his translation style. The other major translator, which I tend to recommend, is Bhikkhu Bodhi. His style is a bit more academic and scholarly, which some people prefer, but other people find a bit hard to read. So it's kind of a personal preference thing, which one you prefer. But I would say start with Bhante Suddhaso, just because it's free and online. It's really hard to pass up that opportunity.
And William says, what's the difference between sensory awareness and mind? How are mind and consciousness similar or different?
So mind is a rather clumsy word that we use in English. So uh, in Pali we have two different words that are used, translated as mind. One is mano or manas, and the other is chitta. They're almost interchangeable, but not quite. Bhikkhu Bodhi actually wrote a really lovely little article about the difference between mano, chitta, and vijnana. So I'd probably refer to you to read that if you wanted a bit more clarity around these terms. What was the question again?
What's the difference between sensory awareness and the mind? How are mind and consciousness similar or different?
I would say start by exploring what sensory consciousness is. Start by exploring what sensory awareness is. And so what is mind? Well, in the context of the six senses, mind is the sixth sense. It's the domain of mental phenomena, the domain of mental objects. So there, the word that's being used is mano, which I think is actually related to the word mind or mental. Yeah, it's the field where mental objects appear. So that's the simplest answer for you. But we also, sometimes we use mind in a more colloquial sense just to mean awareness, or that which is aware. And in that sense, it's perhaps closer to the primordial consciousness. So again, it's a little bit difficult when dealing with English words that have a collection of meanings which are not necessarily exactly the same as the collection of meanings of any given Pali term. So I usually prefer to talk about the Pali terms and to clarify the meaning of those Pali terms and how it relates to our practice. Okay.
And William also says, I'm confused about the difference between the second foundation of mindfulness and the third foundation.
Yeah, this is getting slightly off topic. Actually, maybe we should just put that up for monk chat. Yeah, monk chat. So tomorrow evening we have monk chat, and you can ask that question then and we'll answer.
And Robin says, is it correct to understand mind is the maker of all things as saying that mind assigns meaning to what it observes by saying this form is me and that form is you? Or is it more literal than that the mind wholly fabricates the things it perceives?
Both. Okay, anything else?
How's our friend says, Bhante, the non-sense consciousness you talked about, do they also have the three marks of existence?
Non-sense consciousness.
The second and third kind of consciousness.
Gotcha. Yeah, of course. Everything has the three marks of existence. So we sometimes call those the three universal characteristics because they're universal. Everything, every single thing has these three characteristics. If you're particularly sharp and familiar with Buddhism already, you'll notice that I emphasize the word thing. Every single thing has these three characteristics. I see some smiles from one of the venerables in the audience. And yes, that would include all forms of consciousness. All forms of consciousness are things. They're sankharas, they're conditional phenomena. Therefore, they have the three marks of existence. Okay. Anything else?
We Are the Solution just says, I truly love Buddhists and Rastafari. They walk closer to the truth than most other paths.
Well, I must confess, I know very little about Rastafarianism. so I can't comment on that. But I agree that Buddhism walks close to the truth.
No bias.
I am, in fact, biased, just for the record.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining, for all your interaction, questions, attention. And you can return tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. for some sutta study. And then in the evening at 7:30 p.m., if you have further questions or other questions like yours, William, or any questions related to Buddhism or anything we've spoken about this week. So we can end the evening with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And for our friends on Instagram, we will also be broadcasting the monk chat. So at 7:30 p.m. New York City time. So you can ask questions. Bring all your questions related to Dhamma tomorrow evening. And there will be not 1, not 2, but 3 venerables available to answer questions. All right. Have a good night.